Okay.
I am really excited about this topic today because I recently experienced imposter syndrome and I had no clue what it was until actually you shed some light on it, Cydia.
Oh, I
And
did?
yes, because you had talked about how you kind of experienced that as a baby lawyer.
Yes. As a baby lawyer, it definitely came up.
But what was interesting to me is when I was talking about imposter syndrome to friends and my spouse, they had no idea what imposter syndrome is. Did you ever experience anything like that?
I think for me, it was more of once I got the label, I understood what it meant. And I was like, oh, okay, yeah, I've definitely had that feeling of feeling like I don't belong. And what's interesting for me is where it pops up. It'll pop up in different settings where maybe I just don't know people or I feel like I haven't been my full self. There's so many different things, but I feel like everybody is talking about imposter syndrome. And it's a good opportunity for us to discuss it and see which way it goes. Because I know for myself, I've certainly felt like I needed to dress the part to
Mm-hmm.
actually be a lawyer. And so if I wasn't suiting up when I was a baby lawyer, I was like, oh God, what am I doing? But even when I did suit up, I would feel like I was a wolf in sheep's clothing. And now I don't even care. I can't even go back to wearing a suit right now after this year of not going to court. I'm like, oh, what is this? It's so constricting.
Wolf in sheep's clothing is like the perfect analogy because as COO of an international company, that specializes in appreciative inquiry. I mean, I got to this level within the company because of my level of experience. And yet I still found myself questioning my skill sets, my values. Do I even deserve to be where I am? And so I just recently interviewed with a Penn State student who was charged with interviewing an AI practitioner. And for the longest time, I would decline these interviews because I would just, say that I was too busy. But really, it was because I didn't consider myself an AI practitioner. And it wasn't until I got off the phone with my first ever interview with this Penn State student that I realized I was like, wow, that was absolutely a lie I was telling myself. I am meant to be here. I am an AI practitioner. So when you mentioned that you knew someone that could speak with us about this, I was like, yes.
Yes, no, I'm very excited to invite Noelle Lefforge, Dr. Lefforge. She is an associate professor at UNLV in the Department of Psychology, and she teaches principles and practices of psychotherapy, diversity issues in professional practice, and group psychotherapy. Noelle, thank you so much for being here and joining us in on this conversation on imposter syndrome.
Thank you so much for having me. I am excited to talk about imposter syndrome, both as somebody who has experience firsthand with it and certainly as somebody who hears about it from other folks and knows a thing or two from looking at the literature on it.
So I guess just stripping it down, a lot of people that I was talking to, like I mentioned earlier, like my spouse and even some of our listeners, as I was sourcing out questions, had no idea what imposter syndrome is. How would you define it?
Yeah, well, it was originally a term that came up in 1978 through research. And it's, just feeling not good enough to be in the role or the setting that one is, not feeling like you actually have the expertise or credentials that have been attributed to you. I like the way you said it, Cydia, right? It's this feeling of not belonging at its core. And so if I had to break it down, I mean, I think there's a few things I hope we'll touch on today, but one is certainly like this idea of confidence and or competency, and then also this idea of belongingness.
And what causes someone to experience this?
Yeah, well, it's common. The one thing, well, let me say what I like about it and let me say what I don't like about it, right? So I like it being defined as imposter syndrome because of what you have both kind of said about it being so validating to have a word that describes this experience that's actually pretty pervasive. But of course, not necessarily widely talked about, because if you find yourself experiencing it, the last thing you're going to do is tell one of your colleagues, hey, by the way, I totally don't think I belong here in this job, right? Like, there's not a lot of space to bring it up, right? Yeah. So I love that there's the validation in, oh, there's a term for this, other people experience this. What I don't love about it is this idea of imposter syndrome, like it resides within the individual who's experiencing it, right? That there's something potentially wrong with somebody because they're not feeling more competent or a greater sense of belonging in the situation that they are. One of the things about imposter syndrome is it's way more common in people with marginalized identities. Women experience it. Racial and ethnic minorities tend to experience it more than white people do. I think that makes us, we should kind of step back and think about, well, then what's causing it, right? I actually think a lot of it's caused by the environments we create that don't provide a sense of belonging for everybody, rather than necessarily, somebody who within themselves just doesn't have confidence. Because we see this all the time. People who are confident in other situations find themselves experiencing it predominantly in like workplace kind of, if we think about settings where white supremacy, misogyny, all of those constructs loom large, those are places that we tend to see a lot of imposter syndrome, and we tend to see it in people who aren't historically meant to belong in those situations.
Now, when I think of imposter syndrome, I often think of career development or career advancement. Can imposter syndrome be found in other areas of our life?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can find it anywhere that really maps onto competency. So, I mean, you could feel it in a lot of areas, but it's mostly going to come up in academics or work, places where your performance is frequently evaluated.
I find it really interesting that you're talking about how it seems to be, if it's a traditionally white male dominated space, that's really where you're seeing this. And so as women and people of color break through those glass ceilings, it sounds like they're more likely to experience this phenomenon than their colleagues. Is that about right?
Yeah, I mean, if I have to break it down and think about the micro level, right? Like day-to-day life as for example, a woman of color in a workplace, a professional setting, I am sure you've had the experience where you're sitting around a conference table, you throw out an idea, somebody else echoes that idea and gets all the credit for it, even though you were the one who said it. Like, these things happen all the time, right? Women not getting promoted, even though they've done the same work and are, performing as well, having the same outputs as people who are getting those promotions. I don't understand like how we could receive that feedback from the environment and part of ourselves doesn't question, am I where I belong? Am I as competent as other people? But I think the thing I also want to say is it can generalize. Right? Even if your microcosm is one that has made progress and is more validating of your identities, you still have the generalizations that came from going through the education system. All these different arenas where we're taught to evaluate our competencies, that we're taught what is valued and what isn't valued, right? Male styles of communication tend to be more valued than women's styles of communication. Right, what one brings to the table, there's often kind of these internalized standards of what that is. I think all of that's at play when we start to think about imposter syndrome.
It certainly sounds like it. I'm glad you brought up education, because that's something that just is bubbling up right now, of how often in higher education, and the higher I went in my education, I started feeling like I don't belong here. I'm the only one here, or how am I the only Latina in this honors program? Like it didn't make sense to me. And so just hearing you talk about, okay, we need to evaluate all of the process, I think is really valuable.
Yeah. And I think to really speak at unpacking it and seeing the layers that exist, for example, in a workplace that values solutions over process, right? Somebody coming from a very solution oriented culture is going to get rewarded all the time for having contributions that align with those implicit, usually unspoken values. Whereas somebody who's maybe a lot more process oriented is going to have valuable contributions to give, but it's almost like the setting doesn't know what to do with that.
Mm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I really like what you said about confidence versus competence. And so if a person is looking to recognizes that they are experiencing imposter syndrome, what advice would you give them to slowly either help build confidence? Because it sounds like we typically have the competency needed for whatever, whether it's that academic program, profession. So what advice would you give someone that's looking maybe to build their confidence?
Yeah, it is an important distinction. I mean, I think if we're talking about imposter syndrome, it's a given that the person actually has the competence, right? This is not the same scenario as somebody who's actually getting objective feedback that they're not performing. Imposter syndrome is when all the signals are saying you belong here, you're doing a good job, but your internal stuff is saying, I don't know about all that. They just haven't found out that I don't belong here yet. And so, well, yeah, I think a lot about this. I think it maps onto shame concepts. And so I certainly start thinking about, Brene Brown's work on this. And one of the best ways to find your way through it is to do what we're doing today, like talk about it, And I mean, I think you have to be aware of what dynamics exist within the setting that you're experiencing it. I wouldn't say if there are these major power differentials that you necessarily want to communicate with those colleagues about it. But my guess is that there are other allies in most settings, either within the space that you're feeling it or outside in your other professional networks, exactly like we're doing here today. I mean, I think all three of us have acknowledged that we've experienced that. And I think that starts to really chip away at attributing it to incompetency, right? Like when I look at you, when I look at Cydia, I see competence. And so the fact that I now know that you've both have these thoughts, it starts to kind of bring up this doubt of, whoa, if I see them as competent, but they don't necessarily see it themselves, what does that mean about my own feelings of imposter syndrome? And so I definitely think talking about it, sharing it is one way to start to mitigate it.
Yeah. I like how you brought that up though, because part of it is perception, right? I definitely see two strong, competent, accomplished women, but at the same time, you never know what's going on the inside with people. And this is one of those things that is happening. And I think once at least I can speak for myself, once I had the language of it, I was like, oh, that's what that is. I now know what that is. And I can't say I've actually come up with any tools for myself of how to get myself out of it. But, I've certainly tried, I tried the power posing before depositions. I've done the breathing. I've done these things. And it's interesting to see where it pops up, because in some settings I'm super confident and yeah, I got this. And other times it's not there, even though nothing else has changed.
Yeah. And I think that Noelle brings up a really great point, which is, sometimes, I mean, you can't change the environment you're in depending on where it is that you are. And so for me, it's also been a lot of work on that self-worth, that I am worthy, that what I'm contributing is important, that my voice is important. And so I've done a lot of work with that. With that said, is imposter syndrome considered a mental disorder or illness, or is it just an emotion felt?
Yeah, it's just a phenomenon. It's definitely not something we diagnose. I mean, it could lead, if it were really severe, to other things that we might consider problematic because they impair functioning. But it's really just a phenomenon that frequently occurs. I mean, I think as we're talking, a couple other things come up for me. I mean, I think it's important to validate the experience, to have some understanding of where it stems from. I also think one idea that I have, one thing that's been on my mind a lot is really how do we transform these systems that exist? Why do we have to be so confident in every situation, right? Why is the expectation that we have to appear all-knowing, infallible? I mean, I think all of that is also tied to things like white supremacy and misogyny. And we could all actually benefit if there were fewer expectations of doing those things, because evidence is clear. People that have self-doubt are probably more productive, more likely to be right. I mean, it's a quality, right? To be self-reflective, to accurately view where my weaknesses may be, to be interested in working on those areas, to be forthcoming about where the limits of our knowledge lie. And yet we live in a society that really values brief answers, ultimate clarity, one solution, no ambiguity. And I think all of that is tied up in, I mean, this may be getting outside of what we were intending, but I think it's all connected to this idea of imposter syndrome.
No, it sounds like it is all interrelated, right? And so you hit on one of the words that's, I don't want to say it's my pet peeve, but expectations. Like I have issues with expectations because I've just figured that for my own expectations, like I can do that, but when other people put expectations on me, like I'm much more rebellious now than I think I've ever been, even more so than a teenager, because yeah, we have that expectation, and so as first generation, I feel like there's all these expectations of you're supposed to do this, you're supposed to give back to your family, you're supposed to usher the way for the next generation. It's just all these things, and it's like I'm just trying to do me right now. And so I think with knowing that expectations play a role in this, can that also impact? I'm trying to formulate the right question here. Is it a cause and effect relationship between imposter syndrome and expectations?
One thought I have is, imposter syndrome can really help keep the status quo going, because what happens is people internalize unrealistic expectations. They think, oh, look, it's me, that I'm falling short. No one else is experiencing this. And the system gets to keep asking for more and more and more. When we opened today and you were saying everybody's talking about this, I immediately was like, that's interesting why is everybody talking about it right now? Well, expectations are a huge idea, a big topic throughout this pandemic. Everybody I know has these really unrealistic expectations of how they should be surviving, literally surviving a pandemic. And yet there's all these ideas about what one should be doing and how one should be working and what one should be producing. Yes, expectations and imposter syndrome are totally tied up together.
I love this idea of transforming the system, because as you were talking about, I hate to say this, Cydia, expectations, being a consultant, people often think that I'm this expert. And again, coming back to what you're saying, Noelle, is like in Western culture, we're taught that you have to have the answer. And it doesn't have to be the right answer. It just has to be an answer because you have to play this part. And so I love what you're saying, which is like, we need to get back to asking questions and being real and authentic, because, these expectations are things that we're putting on ourselves, that our profession is putting on us, but they're often unrealistic. And I love that.
Yeah.
Love that.
Yeah, I mean, what values underlie it, right? Because it's definitely getting us away from valuing truth, valuing authenticity, genuineness. Like those are things that I really care about, and a lot of cultures really care about. Mm-hmm. But buying into this whole system definitely moves us away from those and more into quick sell, that like feeling of satisfaction and knowing the right answer, even though it's wrong. I'm just less and less interested in participating in all that.
Mm-hmm. Good for you. I'm excited
good for
about
you
that.
Too. I hear your rebellion as well.
A little bit, but I love what you said there about how this imposter syndrome is enforcing the status quo. Can you talk more about that?
Well, yeah, I just think what you do is you have a bunch of folks who are rising through the ranks, who haven't been in these power positions before. And when one is lost in their imposter syndrome, what do? They shut down, they get quiet, they expect more of themselves, they try to accelerate their behavior to match the expectations so they don't feel the imposter syndrome, rather than looking at the system is messed up. They need to, like, I'm going to bring my value, right? And so the imposter syndrome, it makes people uber productive, but yet silent. I think it's just a reinforcement of the status quo.
Well, and especially when you're feeling less than or not worthy of your position, you're thinking, well, is really what I'm going to say going to be of any contribution or of any value? And if so, who would really want to listen to it anyway?
Mhm. But it sounds to me like there's also a relationship though to burnout, because if you're going to be uber productive and you're going to be that, I'm going to run more, I'm going to bill more, I'm going to do more than anybody else because I have to show that I earned my place here, you're going to eventually leave that spot. And then you got into that cycle of, well, I really didn't belong at that place because I wasn't, smart enough, XYZ, whatever enough. And it's just this vicious spiral.
Absolutely, right? Spending one's lifetime trying to chase unrealistic expectations is a great way to end up completely exhausted, unfulfilled, and ready to leave.
Wow. I just got chills hearing that.
Yeah.
Well, I was, just thinking as Cydia, as you're mentioning about burnout, I know that I've experienced that, and I know Cydia has. And, when you're feeling these feelings of inadequacy, it definitely leads to depression, anxiety, lower productivity at work. I mean, it just snowballs into something greater.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I think about how that reinforces the status quo, because what you end up with are empty seats that somebody who's not experiencing all of this are happy to take, right? If you're not carrying the burden of all this imposter syndrome, it's like, oh, look, everybody wants to hear my opinion. There's research that shows if you start to really get into differential in positions and salaries for men and women, it's in large part that men will keep applying for a position that they're not qualified for, or they will look at a job ad and say, there's no way I'm going to get that, but they'll put in the application anyway, right? And so imposter syndrome can at least function as like this self-regulator that's on overdrive that holds a person back. And then somebody who's not doing that will take that seat.
Wow.
Are there certain things that we could teach people to help them, get out of their own way, is what it sounds like?
Right. Well, I mean, I'm big on identifying these systemic oppressive forces, right? And let's attribute this where it belongs. I mean, the problem is the moment that we start talking about what to do about this, again, the tension falls to the individual, right? What is the person experiencing imposter syndrome supposed to do to not do that? It's like, no, what is the system supposed to do? What is the highest levels of leadership of that organization supposed to do to minimize their employees, their colleagues feeling imposter syndrome? I think some of it is really pulling back the veil that we're pulling back today and seeing where the source is coming from.
For someone that is experiencing low self-worth or inadequacy for their job, I'm just curious if you have any insight as to maybe how they find the courage to amplify their voice or to speak up, because to talk to your boss could be extremely intimidating. So what advice would you give someone like that?
Yeah, well, I think because this has to do with belonging in a core, right? And as human beings, I mean, we're so susceptible to negative impacts if we don't feel that belongingness. Again, I would say you need to get shored up first, find where you do belong, get your energy, get your recharge from that, and figure out ways that you can be kind of rebellious in these other situations that you're not feeling it. But I mean, even before we expect somebody to change the whole system they're in, I do want to make a case for the role of building self-compassion, right? I mean, self-compassion can be a huge antithesis, right? If I'm experiencing self-compassion, that doesn't leave a lot of space for imposter syndrome, right? If I notice it coming up, those thoughts about doubt or those comparisons to, is my work as good as this other person's work? If I can kind of turn that on its head and say, oh, of course I'm having those feelings and thoughts, right? I work in a world that doesn't always value the contributions that people like me make. And of course I'm a conscientious person. That's part of what got me as far as I did. Unfortunately, sometimes my conscientious part is on overdrive and doesn't say helpful things and starts to get into like, you're not as good as you think you are. And it starts to question the things that I am actually good at, right? I think if we can start to talk to ourselves like that, you start to mitigate some of this.
I actually have a question from one of our listeners, Leanne Waddington from Canada. And she was curious if imposter syndrome is a normal part of transition and if imposter syndrome can be a good thing. And if so, sorry, this is a three-parter. And if so, at what point is it no longer healthy?
Yeah, these are great questions. I don't know if I think for most of us, it's a normal part of transition. Again, I think if you have a lot of protective factors, including like privileged identities and lots of experiences of pure success and the road has been paved for you, maybe you can do transitions without imposter syndrome. But a lot of us do experience it. And of course, transition's like a ripe time for imposter syndrome, right? Because there's so much unknown. You are kind of relearning things. You're trying to sort it out. So that makes a lot of sense. And can it be adaptive? I mean, absolutely, it can be adaptive, right? The things that I said, like engaging in self-reflection, questioning one's abilities, doing a scan of where am I strong? Where are my growth edges? Doing something about those growth edges, like all of that is good. One thing that comes to mind, we talk in psychology, there's an anxiety performance curve, right? And so really you want to be at an optimal level of anxiety to be at your peak performance. Too little anxiety, you're probably not worried enough to do as much as you could to do a good job. But if you go into overdrive, your anxiety takes over, you're in that fight, flight, freeze place, and you can't do a good job. So I think some imposter syndrome can, be some of that fuel to ignite performance. When does it get to be too much? When you start to cross over into questioning yourself so much that you are frozen, that you are paralyzed, that you can't do the work, that you are silent, and it shuts down your performance.
Wow. You had so many fantastic things in there. I just want to go back real quick. Growth edges. I've never heard that term before. Can you please tell me what that is?
Yeah, so I do a lot of clinical training and supervision. And so as a professor, as a supervisor, that's the way we tend to think about competencies and how to develop is, you definitely have your strengths and then everything else is a growth edge. With this, I think some of this fits into growth mindsets versus not. And imposter syndrome fits with that too, right? Imposter syndrome is much more, I'm just like this and there's no room to grow. Whereas growth mindsets are all about, I don't know, if you water and seed that patch of ground, you're probably going to grow some really good stuff out of it.
I love it.
I do. I love that.
I do have another question from another listener. Her name is Kelly Montenegro from Las Vegas. And she was curious if imposter syndrome is something we develop in childhood or does it manifest later in life?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know the technical answer to that. I mean, I think that there are seeds of this that develop. I mean, I definitely have memories as a kid of feeling like I didn't belong or wasn't quite good enough to be where I was. Mm-hmm. But then when you're developing as a kid, there's so much more room to think, but I'll get there. Right. I mean, that's one of the biggest things that changes through development is if you look at little kids, like there's a reason little kids think that they'll be able to fly one day or outgrow because they're constantly being surprised by what they couldn't do yesterday that they could do today. I think as we settle into adulthood, really measuring like what we're capable of is a very different question. And so I've never heard like imposter syndrome really been used with children or even adolescents. I think it's more of an adult phenomenon. But by that, I don't want to say that there aren't analogous experiences earlier in life.
That makes a lot of sense. I want to go back to self-compassion. And one of the things I heard today in another space that was talking about imposter syndrome was eliminating the vocabulary or the words of saying, I'm so lucky. And not saying that anymore. That was a suggestion. And as I'm hearing you talk, I'm thinking that's a way of kind of practicing some of that self-compassion, right? Instead of saying, oh, I'm just lucky that I got here. It's like, no, you actually worked really hard to get here. And so reframing that can be an act of self-compassion. Do you have any thoughts on the language that we could use to help us, shake off that feeling of imposter syndrome?
Yeah, well, I'll actually pivot to talk about a little bit that was sparked from what you were saying. If we look at like cognitive type therapies, one thing that we know is people make a lot of misattributions, right? And especially people who are distressed or struggling are a lot more likely to attribute other people's success to their efforts and their own to a circumstance or unchangeable factors. And then they do the opposite for the good things that come in life, right? And you can see how this would set you. Someone's at the front door. You could see how this would set you up to just kind of go down that spiral, right? Like if you're attributing all your success to something that you couldn't change and all your failures to being all your fault, and you're doing the opposite for everyone else, it can really become kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So and then cutting back to kind of what you were talking about, the way we talk to ourselves, absolutely, right? I mean, sometimes we can use comparisons in a compassionate way, like being truly experiencing gratitude for what we have. But, the way that you just said that, right? Like, I'm lucky. There's kind of like this superficial, like unexamined, not really taking credit for what one may have invested and accomplished.
I know we're just both like, there's so much here.
Well, because I delve a lot into social constructionism. And so everything forms our reality. And that includes the people we hang out with, the books we read, the organization we work for, the language we tell ourselves. It becomes our reality. And so I love, kind of what you're saying is it's just like looking at kind of stripping everything down and looking at the language we're telling ourselves and how that might impact or influence what we're feeling in terms of imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
When we're talking about the systems and, seeing why is the system doing this, how does one try to navigate in a system where they just don't perhaps acknowledge or recognize that imposter syndrome might be a thing that people are experiencing?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm glad you're doing this podcast to open up dialogue about it. I do think it helps to not feel entirely alone with it. But I think it's also it is worth at least some reflection on, like, am I in the system that I want to be in? I think in my life, my imposter syndrome has been the worst, actually, when I was in situations that weren't a great fit for me. And I mean, I think part of it is normative. Like whenever you're learning something new, of course, you're not going to feel competent at it. Sometimes I just need to wait it out. Like this is part of my path, but noticing that it's getting better. But I think it would be a worthy point of reflection in one's life. If you've been in it for quite a while, there's a way that like you've given yourself enough time to acclimate, but you're still just constantly feeling like you don't belong, like it's, not taking advantage of your skill set. But rather than turning it upon yourself and saying, there's something wrong with me that I don't fit into this system, looking at what's going on with this system and am I, is this a square peg, round hole situation?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, you've just provided me a lot of food for thought. So I'm sorry, I'm just so quiet. I'm just here reflecting. I'm like, is this are these things that I'm telling myself, or what's the system like? So I thank you. I never thought that the system itself, the organization, the industry could be what's perpetuating what I was feeling.
Yeah.
So thank you for bringing that to light.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you get to that point where you start to notice, yeah, there are some things that don't fit. I mean, one option is always to leave that system, but that's not the only option. I mean, I think we talked a little bit about if you can find support or connection within the system, great. You know, if you do feel comfortable with your boss or your colleague, go ahead and talk to them, but that may not be the case. I know for me, I mean, it's been finding outside networks. You know, City and I did meet through Emerge, and that is an amazing group of women who are all about lifting one another up and being reflective about this is where I see your strength. And it's impossible, I found, to be immersed in that and then go into another setting without it rubbing off and without bringing kind of that light of, wait a minute, these people over here think I bring a lot of value to the table. Why is that not being seen in this particular setting?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's also something there about earning your place or that feeling of it. And so I had one of my team members reached out to me this week actually and was like, hey, there's something I really want to do. I want to get this special license plate, and it's got a name that she doesn't want me to air because she still hasn't secured it at the DMV, but wanting to know, hey, do you think I can do this? Because I haven't earned it yet. I haven't earned this thing that I'm aspiring to. And I stepped back and I said, well, is it going to remind you of your goal every day? Yes, absolutely. Okay, go for it. You don't need my permission as an attorney to say, yeah, you can go get that legal related thing because it's something that you want. And so I feel like sometimes in imposter syndrome, you know, do I call it a mindset? I don't know. Sometimes we feel like, well, I haven't earned it yet. I haven't been practicing enough. I haven't been doing, you know, it goes back to all of that enough stuff. And so really, I'd rather just stay small and it'll be safer here.
Yeah. I love that story. I mean, I think we're starting to talk about a few things. You know, one is allyship, right? And how do those of us who have worked through this, even if we haven't worked through it in every realm of our life forevermore, but how do we act as allies to people coming after us who are talking about feeling these things? And that, I think one of the barriers there, again, is kind of systematic, right? Like we have this idea that you shouldn't ask for that reassurance, right? Like you shouldn't need somebody's permission to do something because that would be like dependency. But we're like so socially wired. Like, of course we need other people to provide validation, to provide approval. And, you know, I'm not saying like you need to constantly go around saying like, is it okay that I did this? But it's so helpful, I think, as you are kind of exploring what is my role? Have I achieved what is of value? To have somebody who you can ask in the way that she asked you, and that you can kind of just say, yeah, you're good enough for it. Like, what is this even about? I think that that's immensely powerful.
Okay. Allyship checked off. All right. I like that.
But I mean, kudos to you, Cydia, for creating a space where she felt comfortable to share or to ask that. Because I mean, we're talking about looking at the systems and you're helping create a system that invites dialogue. So I think that that's kudos to you.
Well, thank you. I didn't share it for that, but mostly for just knowing that a lot of times we feel like we need that permission from somebody, and it's like, okay, well, I'll give you the permission. And I told her that too. I was like, I'm going to give this to you, even though you don't actually need it from me. But if that's what you feel that you need in order to do this thing that is going to help motivate you and drive you towards your end goal, here you go.
Yeah. Well, and I think that is such an important part of allyship is, you know, kind of looking across the system and looking for moments when somebody might not feel belonging and not always making them ask for it, but like reaching out, right? I think as a supervisor, as a professor, I'm often telling my students their value unsolicited by them because I know they need to hear it. I know that they're not always getting that message. I know that their internal dialogue is not always providing that message. And so why would I withhold that? I mean, I think we're kind of socialized sometimes to withhold it, right? Like they need to find it on their own. But that's true. It's just the way we figure out who we are is through our interactions with others. And so somebody saying like, I see you, I value you, you're good at this. We all benefit from that.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. I think even with you, um, mentioning that to your students and bringing them up, it's the same thing with the student that reached out to Melissa, right? That's that validation of, hey, I'm going to bring you here because I think that you have something that I want to know. And if we're able to plant those seeds in other people, then they start seeing it for themselves. And I can certainly say that I've had mentors who have done that for me. I've had colleagues who've done that for me and nominating me for things where you wouldn't have done it yourself.
Yep.
But somebody else saw that potential in you and you go, oh, okay, well, I guess I can try to lean into that a little bit.
Yep. Yeah. Those are such good examples of making this into a reality. Right. And I think especially we kind of have to contain the feedback that maybe the system isn't providing, right? Like based on all the things I said about the status quo, people are already hearing certain things from the system, right? If you get an A on a paper, that's the way the system says you're good enough. If you win your trial, like that's the way the system says you're good enough. But looking for ways that are not intrinsically going to be valued or rewarded by the system and being the one to give voice to those is immensely powerful.
Noelle, I could talk to you about this all day. I just find what you say fascinating. My page is all filled up with like quotable quotes, growth edges, all these things. So thank you so much for spending this afternoon with City and I. What we do with each guest that we bring on is we like to ask 2 signature questions. And I know you didn't get the form ahead of time, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So the first one is, looking back, what would you tell your younger self?
Oh, that's such a good question. What would I tell my younger self? Well, I think obviously this is on the mind because of what we're talking about. And I think if asked outside the situation, I'd probably still say the same. I wish that I could tell my younger self, you are enough, in a way that my younger self would be able to let some of it in. And that, don't spend so much time trying to prove it, but enjoy it.
Mm-hmm. I love how you phrase that in a way that my younger self would let a little bit of it in, because I think that is something that, as much as I want to hug my 12-year-old self, I'm not sure she would let me sometimes.
Yep. I can definitely imagine my younger self kind of rolling her eyes. You just don't know me well enough to say that. But if I could, I would.
And looking forward, what one wish do you have for yourself on your current journey?
I think my wish now is a lot less about me and a lot more about the impact that I could have on the world. I guess if I had to boil it down, I hope to leave this world better than when I got here. And I guess what I mean by that is like better for other people's lives and quality of life, especially for, folks who that doesn't come easy for.
Wow. Thank you. And any last words on what we've talked about or anything else?
Yeah, I do think one other side of imposter syndrome that we didn't have a chance to touch on too much, through the pandemic, I don't know if you all got to see the memes related to the Dunning-Kruger effect. Are you familiar?
A little bit.
Right. So this idea that, in some ways established, like if you know a little bit about something or like nothing about something, you tend to be pretty confident and think that you know enough about it. And the more you know about something up until you reach like professional expert, tons of experience, you really start to see all the doubt. So again, just reflecting on like the ways that imposter syndrome could have value. There's like a healthy amount of not feeling super confident, right? Like not being a person who thinks they know everything there is to know about COVID because they watched a YouTube video, right? So it is good to have like accurate self-assessments. I think what gets problematic with imposter syndrome is they're not exactly accurate either, right? They tend to be underestimations of what somebody knows and is capable of.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Noelle, for joining us today. I learned so much.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I loved it.
Yes, thank you.
We want to hear from you. How are you owning your voice and experience to minimize imposter syndrome? Let us know in our private Facebook group, Pivotal Moments HQ. We want to thank our producer and music director, Ron Johnson. This has been an Esther Nemekis DMR production. Thank you for listening. Remember, it's never too late and you're right on time.